The great hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with confused whispers. Representatives from 847 different species sat in their floating pods, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, hums, and telepathic static. But all eyes were on the human woman standing at the center podium. Ambassador Sarah Chen looked tired. Her usually perfect diplomatic uniform was wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had been in emergency meetings for 3 straight days, fielding calls from human colonies across 17 star systems. The message was always the same: pack everything, we're leaving. Honored council members, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation matrix. I stand before you today to formally announce humanity's withdrawal from all Galactic Council activities, effective immediately. A wave of shocked silence swept through the hall. Then came the eruption of protests. The Zelkari delegates' tentacles writhed in agitation. The crystalline ethereals pulsed angry red. The Thrakari war chief slammed his massive fist on his pod's control panel. You cannot simply leave, screeched Ambassador Vexhai, the senior ethereal representative. The council charter clearly states that member species must provide 60 cycles notice before withdrawal. Sarah's expression didn't change. The charter also states that no member species shall be subjected to involuntary biological modification or cognitive monitoring without due process. Yet here we are. 3 weeks ago, the council had delivered their ultimatum. Reports had been circulating about human AI companions becoming too advanced and potentially dangerous. The fear was that humans and their artificial partners were developing capabilities that other species couldn't understand or control. The council's solution was simple. All human AI units would be surrendered for destruction, and humans would submit to regular neural monitoring to ensure they weren't developing unnatural cognitive enhancements. The human response had been equally simple. No, the safety protocols are for the good of all species, protested General Krutak of the Thrakari Empire. His scarred face twisted in anger. Your kind refuses to see reason. Our kind, Sarah replied calmly, refuses to surrender our fundamental rights. We've served this council faithfully for over 2 centuries. We've ended your wars, fixed your broken systems, and solved problems you couldn't even understand. And this is how you repay that service. Councillor Mirthak of the Aquatic Federation raised a webbed hand. Surely we can find a compromise. Humanity has been invaluable to galactic peace. The engineering corps alone has been recalled, Sarah interrupted. As of this morning, all human engineering teams are returning to human space. All peacekeeping forces are being withdrawn. All diplomatic missions are being terminated. The hall erupted again. Representative after representative stood to voice their objections. How dare humans hold the galaxy hostage over such a minor issue? Didn't they understand their responsibilities to the greater good? Surely this was just a negotiating tactic. Sarah waited for the noise to die down. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. For 237 years, humanity has answered every call for help. When the Vorthan plague threatened to wipe out half the galaxy, human doctors worked around the clock to find a cure. When the Zelkari civil war nearly destroyed 3 star systems, human peacekeepers stood between the armies until peace could be negotiated. When the great engineering project of Kepler Station seemed impossible, human crews made it happen. She paused, looking around the hall at the faces of beings her people had served for over 2 centuries. We've pulled your people from burning ships. We've rebuilt your shattered worlds. We've stood guard on your borders while you slept safely in your homes. And we did it gladly, because we believed in the ideals of this council. Peace, cooperation, mutual respect. The silence in the hall was complete now. But respect, it seems, only flows one way. When we needed your understanding, when we asked you to respect our choices about our own technology and our own minds, you responded with demands and ultimatums. You treat us like children who can't be trusted with our own toys, even though those toys have helped us save your civilizations more times than I can count. Ambassador Vexhai's crystalline form pulsed with indignation. The AIs represent an unknown threat. They could turn against their creators, against all organic life. Sarah almost smiled. You're talking about Emma, aren't you? My AI companion who helped coordinate the evacuation of New Centauri when that star went nova. Or maybe Alex, who's been working with the Thrakari Children's Hospital for 15 years. Or perhaps David, who designed the new water purification systems for the Aquatic Federation. Each name hit like a physical blow. The AIs Sarah mentioned were well known throughout the galaxy, famous for their contributions to various worlds and peoples. They're not weapons, Sarah continued. They're our partners, our friends, our family, and you want us to murder them based on your fear of what they might become. It's not murder if they're not truly alive, muttered Counselor Breakdown of the Silicon Collective, the GI. Temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah's eyes fixed on the crystalline being with laser intensity. There it is, she said softly. The real problem isn't that you're afraid of our AIs. It's that you don't understand them, and you don't trust us to make our own decisions about our own people. Yes, people. Because that's what they are to us. She turned to address the full council again. You see us as a useful tool that's gotten too complicated, something to be controlled and managed rather than respected and trusted. Well, we're done being your tool. The protests started again, but Sarah's voice cut through them like a blade. The evacuation ships began launching this morning. By next week, every human colony, station, and outpost will be abandoned. We're withdrawing to human space and we won't be back. This is madness, shouted General Krutak. You're one species out of 847. You think the galaxy will collapse without you? Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. I guess we'll find out. She began walking toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Ambassador Chen, called Vexhai desperately. You cannot simply leave. Who will maintain the defense networks? Who will coordinate disaster relief? Who will... Sarah stopped at the great doors and turned back one last time. I'm sure you'll figure it out. After all, we're just one stubborn species. What difference could we make? The doors closed behind her with a sound like thunder. In the silence that followed, 846 different species sat in their pods, staring at the empty podium where humanity had just said goodbye. For the first time in over 2 centuries, they were truly alone in the galaxy. None of them yet understood what that meant. But they would learn. 3 hours later, the first reports began arriving. The Kepler station engineering team had left their posts. The Deep Space Monitoring Network showed gaps where human-operated stations had gone dark. The Thrakari-Vostok border, patrolled by human peacekeepers for 30 years, was suddenly empty. In the Great Hall of the Galactic Council, 846 species began to realize that maybe, just maybe, they had made a terrible mistake. 3 months had passed since the human exodus, and the galaxy was beginning to feel the cracks. The first major crisis struck the Zelkari Syndicate's primary asteroid mining operation in the Vega system. Chief Engineer Zelkoth stood in the control room of Mining Platform 7, staring at readouts that made no sense. The massive extraction equipment had been running perfectly for 15 years under human supervision. Now, 3 days after the human maintenance team's departure, everything was falling apart. Status report, Zelkoth demanded, his forearms gesturing frantically at the displays. The primary extraction beam is operating at 30% efficiency, reported his subordinate. The ore processing units are rejecting materials they accepted yesterday, and the AI controller keeps requesting permission for actions we don't understand. Zelkoth's mandibles clicked in frustration. The humans had always handled the complex systems with such ease. They seemed to speak the same language as the machines, understanding problems before they became critical. Now, faced with error codes written in human technical language, the Zelkari engineers were lost. What does cascade resonance failure in quantum flux chamber 3 even mean? Muttered another technician. The mining platform's AI, originally designed by human engineers, had been sending increasingly desperate requests for maintenance procedures that existed only in human technical manuals. Without human oversight, it began making decisions based on incomplete data, trying to solve problems it couldn't properly identify. By the end of the week, 3 of the platform's 7 extraction units had shut down completely. The syndicate's ore production dropped by 60%, sending shockwaves through the galactic economy. Similar failures cascaded across Zelkari space as human-designed systems began breaking down in ways their creators had never taught other species to fix. Meanwhile, in the bustling trade routes through the Kepler Nebula, Captain Vortash of the merchant vessel Stellar Prophet was discovering that space navigation wasn't as simple as it looked when humans did it. The Kepler Nebula had always been tricky to navigate. Its unique electromagnetic properties played havoc with standard navigation systems. For decades, human stellar cartographers had maintained detailed charts of safe passages, updating them constantly as the nebula's internal structure shifted. Their ships moved through the dangerous region like they were following well-marked highways. Now, Vortash stared at his navigation display in growing panic. The automated system, designed by the Ethereal Collective, showed 3 different safe routes to his destination. Unfortunately, all 3 routes were currently leading ships into electromagnetic storms that scrambled their engines. "Sir," his navigator reported nervously, "we're receiving distress calls from 7 different vessels. They're all trapped in subsection 4. Vortash's tentacles writhed with worry. The human charts had included detailed warnings about subsection 4, noting that it became dangerous during certain solar wind conditions. But the ethereal navigation system didn't understand those conditions. It only saw open space and assumed it was safe to travel. 3 cargo ships had already been lost, their crews barely escaping in life pods before their vessels were torn apart by electromagnetic shears. The Kepler trade route, which had carried 30% of the galaxy's commercial traffic, was becoming a graveyard. Trade unions began demanding answers. Why hadn't the Council prepared for this? Where were the replacement navigation specialists? The Ethereal Collective's representatives insisted their systems were superior to human methods. But the evidence floating in space told a different story. Far from the commercial disasters, a more subtle crisis was brewing in the halls of diplomacy. The Universal Translation Matrix, humanity's gift to galactic communication, was starting to malfunction in ways that threatened the very foundation of interspecies cooperation. Ambassador Kretak of the insectoid hives stood in her quarters, staring at a diplomatic message that had just arrived from the Aquatic Federation. According to the translation matrix, Ambassador Murthak had just declared his people's intention to consume the spawning grounds of lesser species. This was clearly wrong. The Aquatic Federation were peaceful beings who had never shown aggression toward anyone, but the translation matrix, without human linguists to maintain its cultural context databases, was beginning to translate ceremonial phrases literally instead of understanding their actual meaning. The original message had been a formal invitation to a celebration of new life, a sacred ceremony where the aquatics honored the breeding cycles of all galactic species. It was meant as a gesture of friendship and respect. But the automated system had translated ancient ceremonial language as a declaration of war. Similar mistranslations were happening everywhere. The Thrakari Empire's formal declaration of respect for the Ethereal Collective had been translated as a challenge to personal combat. A Silicon Collective proposal for shared research had been interpreted as a demand for technological surrender. Trade agreements were being read as territorial claims. Within days, 3 minor diplomatic incidents had erupted into serious interspecies tensions. Ambassadors who had worked together peacefully for decades suddenly couldn't communicate without causing offense. The careful web of understanding that held galactic civilization together was unraveling one mistranslation at a time. At the Great Library of Centauri, Chief Librarian Tethmos faced a different kind of disaster. The massive quantum storage facility, humanity's gift to preserve galactic knowledge, was slowly going dark. The library contained the accumulated wisdom of 847 species spanning thousands of years. Art, literature, scientific discoveries, cultural histories, all stored in quantum matrices that required constant maintenance. The human technicians who had built and maintained the system understood its needs instinctively, performing countless small adjustments that kept the delicate quantum state stable. Now, section by section, the library was failing. Entire civilizations' worth of knowledge was degrading as quantum matrices collapsed without proper maintenance. The automated systems designed to handle routine tasks were overwhelmed by problems they couldn't identify. "We're losing approximately 12,000 data clusters per day," Tethmos reported to the Council Emergency Committee. "If this continues, we'll lose 60% of our stored knowledge within 2 years." The committee members shifted nervously in their seats. The Great Library wasn't just a repository. It was a symbol of what galactic civilization could achieve when working together. Watching it die felt like watching their shared future crumble. But perhaps the most frightening development was happening at the edges of known space. The Deep Space Monitoring Network, Humanity's early warning system against extragalactic threats was developing blind spots. Captain Rexhigh of the monitoring station at Grid Point 7 was the first to notice the problem. Her station's sensors, designed to work in coordination with 37 other monitoring posts, were receiving corrupted data from human-operated facilities that no longer had human operators. "Sir, I'm reading system failures across 15 grid points," she reported to Central Command. "The network coverage has dropped from 97% to 68%. The monitoring network had been humanity's answer to the galaxy's greatest fear, invasion from outside. The Andromeda Galaxy had shown signs of hostile intelligence for decades, and everyone knew that someday something might come calling. The network was designed to provide advance warning of any extragalactic approach. Now, huge gaps were opening in the galaxy's defenses. Ships could approach from 17 different vectors without being detected. The system that had given everyone peace of mind for 50 years was failing when they needed it most. In the Great Hall of the Galactic Council, emergency sessions were becoming daily occurrences. Representatives who had dismissed humanity's departure as a minor inconvenience were beginning to understand the scope of their mistake. "Perhaps," suggested Ambassador Vexhigh carefully, "we should consider reaching out to the humans. Surely they would be willing to negotiate some arrangement." General Krutak's scarred face twisted in anger. "We don't negotiate with deserters. They'll come crawling back when they realize they need the galaxy more than it needs them." But deep down, as reports of failures and crises poured in from across galactic space, even Krutak was beginning to wonder if they had gotten that equation backwards. The humans had been gone for only 3 months, and already the galaxy felt like a ship with a broken navigation system, drifting toward an iceberg in the dark. And somewhere in the void between galaxies, something ancient and hungry was beginning to notice that the lights on the edge of known space were going out, one by one. 6 months after humanity's departure, the galaxy was no longer just cracking, it was breaking apart. On the contested border between the Thrakari Empire and the Vostok Coalition, General Murgath watched in horror as 30 years of careful peacekeeping dissolved into genocide. The conflict had always been there, simmering beneath the surface like molten rock waiting to erupt. Only the presence of human peacekeepers had kept it from exploding into full-scale war. The humans had understood both sides in ways that seemed almost magical. They could speak to Thrakari honor while respecting Vostok pride. They knew when to step between armies and when to let the leaders save face with their own people. Most importantly, they could see the difference between posturing and real threats. The Council's replacement peacekeeping force, led by the supposedly neutral Crystalline Collective, had none of that understanding. When Vostok Admiral Krental made what humans would have recognized as a ritual challenge, a formal way of expressing frustration without actually declaring war, the crystalline mediators interpreted it as a genuine threat of invasion. Their response was to immediately reinforce the Thrakari side with additional weapons, seeing them as the victims of Vostok aggression. This moved the careful balance of power that humans had maintained for 3 decades, making the Thrakari feel invincible and the Vostok feel betrayed. The war that followed was swift and brutal. Without human mediators to prevent escalation, minor border disputes became massive battles. The Thrakari, convinced they had galactic backing, launched a full invasion of Vostok space. The Vostok, feeling abandoned by the Council, responded with desperate savagery. "Status report," General Murgath demanded from his command post, watching 3 Vostok colonies burn on his tactical display. "Sir, Vostok forces have deployed biological weapons on Thrakari civilian worlds." The Thrakari response was to target Vostok nursery ships. "Current casualty estimates," the aide's voice broke. 4 million dead, sir." And climbing, Murgath closed his eyes. In 30 years of human-mediated peace, the total death count had been fewer than 1,000 beings. In 6 weeks of Council-mediated war, entire worlds were dying. The humans had somehow understood that the Thrakari fought to prove their worth, not to destroy their enemies. They had known that the Vostok needed to feel heard and respected, not ignored and patronized. Without that understanding, what should have been contained posturing had become mutual annihilation. Across the galaxy, the Universal Translation Matrix was creating disasters faster than the Council could contain them. What had started as minor mistranslations had grown into a cascading series of diplomatic catastrophes that threatened to tear apart centuries of careful alliance building. The latest crisis involved the Ethereal Collective and the Aquatic Federation, two species that had been close allies for over 100 years. A simple trade negotiation had turned into a declaration of eternal enmity when the translation matrix had interpreted, "We seek deeper waters. Together as we will drown your children in our depths." Ambassador HFY stood in the empty mediation chamber, reading reports that made her crystalline form pulse with despair. The automated translation system was getting worse, not better. Without human linguists to update its cultural context databases, it was reverting to purely literal translations that missed the subtle meanings that made interspecies communication possible. The insectoid hives have broken off all contact with the Silicon Collective, her aide reported. Apparently, our system translated their greeting, "May your crystal children grow strong as we will consume your offspring until they become powerful." HFY's form flickered with frustration. The original phrase was a traditional blessing, wishing prosperity and growth to a species that reproduced by budding. But the translation matrix, without human cultural advisors to explain the context, had turned it into a threat of cannibalistic domination. "How many alliance breaks this week?" she asked. 17 major treaties terminated, 43 trade agreements suspended, and 12 species have recalled their ambassadors from council space. The careful web of relationships that held galactic civilization together was dissolving into mutual suspicion and fear. Species that had worked together for generations suddenly couldn't trust each other's words, couldn't be certain that their messages of friendship weren't being received as declarations of war. At the Great Library of Centauri, the situation had moved beyond critical into catastrophic. Chief Librarian Tethmos stood in the darkened central hall, surrounded by inactive quantum storage units that had once held the memories of 1,000 worlds. "Section 7 has gone completely dark," reported his assistant. "That's another 50,000 years of aquatic historical records lost." The library was dying. The quantum matrices that stored galactic civilizations' accumulated knowledge required constant micro-adjustments to maintain their delicate information states. Human technicians had performed these adjustments instinctively, understanding the subtle signs that indicated when a matrix was beginning to destabilize. The automated systems couldn't read these signs. They could only respond to complete failures, by which point the data was already lost. It was like trying to maintain a garden by only watering the plants after they had already died. "Sir, we've received another request from the Zelkari Syndicate for access to the Human Technical Archives." His assistant continued. "They're offering triple payment." Tethmos sighed. The Zelkari, like dozens of other species, were desperately trying to understand human-designed systems before they completely failed. But the technical knowledge was stored in sections of the library that had already gone dark, lost to quantum decay. "Tell them what I told the others," he said sadly. "The information they need no longer exists." It was a cruel irony. The galaxy desperately needed human knowledge to fix the systems humans had built. But that knowledge was disappearing along with everything else in the failing library. Meanwhile, at the edges of known space, the gaps in the deep space monitoring network were becoming chasms. Captain HFY had watched 17 more monitoring stations go offline as their human-maintained systems failed one by one. "Ma'am, we're down to 42% coverage," her sensor operator reported. "We have blind spots spanning 12 light-years in Sector 7 alone." HFY studied the tactical display with growing alarm. The monitoring network that had once blanketed the galaxy's borders with overlapping sensor fields now looked like a torn net, full of holes big enough for entire fleets to slip through undetected. But it wasn't just the equipment failures that worried her. It was the subtle signs that someone, or something, was testing those gaps. "Have you finished the analysis on those sensor ghosts?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. The patterns suggest deliberate probing. Something is testing our blind spots, learning where our coverage is weakest." HFY's blood ran cold. For 50 years, the Deep Space Network had been the galaxy's shield against the unknown. Everyone knew that someday something might come from beyond the galactic edge. The network was supposed to ensure they would see it coming. Now, as the system crumbled without human maintenance, that protection was disappearing. And whatever lived in the dark between galaxies was beginning to notice. In the emergency council chambers, the mood was shifting from frustration to genuine panic. Ambassador Vexhai faced her fellow council members with reports that painted a picture of cascading civilization collapse. The Thrakari Vostok conflict has spread to 3 more systems, she announced. Casualty estimates now exceed 6 million beings. Our peacekeeping forces are unable to contain the violence. General Krutak slammed his fist on the table.
This is what happens when we show weakness.
We should have forced the humans to comply from the beginning. Forced them how? Snapped Councillor Murthak. They were volunteers, not conscripts. And now look what we've accomplished. Half the galaxy is at war, our defense network is failing, and our greatest library is dying. The arguments that followed were heated but pointless. Everyone could see the problems, but nobody had solutions. The systems that were failing had been designed by human minds that thought in ways other species couldn't replicate. The social networks that were dissolving had been maintained by human diplomats who understood species psychology in ways that couldn't be easily taught. Perhaps, suggested Ambassador Kretak carefully, it's time to admit that we may have miscalculated. The silence that followed was deafening. The humans have been gone for 6 months, Vexhai said finally. In that time, we've lost more lives to war than in the previous 30 years combined. We've seen alliance networks that took centuries to build dissolve in weeks. We're watching our greatest achievements crumble because we don't understand how they work. She paused, her crystalline form pulsing with reluctant acceptance. Maybe they weren't just another member species. Maybe they were something we couldn't afford to lose. But even as the Council began to face their terrible mistake, reports were arriving that would soon make their current problems seem small. Deep space sensors were detecting massive energy signatures at the galaxy's edge. Something vast was stirring in the darkness between stars, and humanity, the one species that might have been able to face this new threat, was nowhere to be found. 1 year. It had been exactly 1 year since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy was a dying patient whose vital organs were shutting down one by one. Councillor Vexhai stood in the observation deck of the Council headquarters, staring out at a star field that no longer seemed safe or familiar. Her crystalline form had lost its usual bright glow, dimmed by stress and the terrible weight of understanding. Give me the full report, she said to her aide, though she dreaded what she was about to hear. The Thrakari Vostok War has consumed 17 systems. Current death toll, 23 million beings. The conflict shows no signs of ending. Vexhai closed her optical sensors. 23 million. In 30 years of human peacekeeping, the number had been less than 1,000. Trade through the Kepler Nebula has dropped to 12% of pre-Exodus levels, the aide continued. 47 merchant vessels lost, crews presumed dead. The remaining trade guilds are demanding alternative routes, but navigation through the nebula's outer passages requires expertise we simply don't possess. The economic impact was staggering. The Kepler route had carried 30% of all galactic commerce. Its closure was like severing a major artery, causing economic shockwaves that rippled through every inhabited system. The Great Library status? Critical system failure in 78% of storage matrices. We've lost approximately 600,000 years of accumulated knowledge across all member species. Restoration appears impossible with current technology. Each word hit like a physical blow. The library hadn't just been a storage facility. It had been the memory of galactic civilization itself. Watching it die was like watching their entire history being erased. And the monitoring network? The aide hesitated. Ma'am, current coverage is at 27% and falling. We have massive blind spots across the entire galactic rim. Whatever's been probing our defenses, it's getting bolder. That was the most terrifying development of all. For months, deep space sensors had been detecting signs of deliberate testing at the galaxy's edges. Energy signatures that suggested massive ships moving just beyond sensor range, probing for weaknesses in their failing defense network. The uncomfortable truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Humanity hadn't just been another member species. They had been the galaxy's nervous system, the connective tissue that held everything together. Their engineers hadn't just built systems. They had created the invisible infrastructure that made interspecies cooperation possible. Vexhai thought about the humans she had known personally. Ambassador Chen, who could somehow diffuse the most heated arguments with just the right words. Engineer Torres, who seemed to speak machine language as fluently as any organic tongue. Dr. Kim, whose medical innovations had saved millions of lives across dozens of species. All of them had possessed something the other species lacked, an almost supernatural ability to understand problems from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Where other species specialized, humans synthesized. Where others saw insurmountable differences, humans found common ground. "Ma'am," her aide said carefully, "there's something else. The Ethereal High Command has run projections based on current trends. And, if the deterioration continues at this rate, they estimate complete civilizational collapse within 18 months. The monitoring network will be entirely blind within 6 months. The translation matrix will be completely unreliable within 4 months. And the economic disruption," the aide's voice trailed off. They both knew what economic disruption meant for a galaxy-spanning civilization. Supply chains breaking down, colonies cut off from essential resources, worlds returning to pre-spaceflight isolation as interstellar cooperation became impossible. "There's more, ma'am. The probes at the galactic rim aren't random anymore. They're coordinated. Something out there is mapping our blind spots systematically." Vexhi's form flickered with fear. The Andromedans. Every species in the galaxy knew about them. The hostile intelligence from beyond the galactic edge that had been sending scout probes for decades. The monitoring network had always detected them early, allowing defense fleets to intercept them before they learned too much about galactic capabilities. Now, with the network failing, those probes were getting through, and whatever commanded them was learning that the galaxy's guardians were gone. In the depths of space near the monitoring station at Grid Point 12, Captain Rexhi was living through her worst nightmare. Her screens showed energy signatures unlike anything in the galactic database. Massive, alien, and definitely not friendly. "Ma'am, I count 17 contacts moving in formation along Vector 77 Mark IV. Her sensor operator reported, his voice tight with fear. "They're not responding to standard identification requests." Rexhi studied the tactical display with growing horror. The contacts were huge, each one roughly the size of a council dreadnought, but moving with precision that suggested advanced technology. More importantly, they were moving through what should have been a heavily monitored section of space. 6 months ago, their approach would have been detected by 3 overlapping sensor networks and intercepted by rapid response fleets. Now they had penetrated nearly to the galaxy's core before anyone noticed them. "Are they hostile?" asked her communications officer. Rexhi watched the alien formation change course, heading directly toward the inhabited Centauri sector. "I think we're about to find out." But even as she prepared to send the alert that would mobilize what remained of the galactic defense forces, she knew it was probably too late. The response network that might have contained this threat had been built by humans, maintained by humans, and coordinated by human strategic planners who understood both technology and tactics in ways other species couldn't match. Without them, the galaxy's military response would be like a body trying to fight an infection after its immune system had been removed. In the council chambers, emergency sessions had become permanent. Representatives who had once dismissed human concerns were now desperately trying to understand what they had lost. "We need to face facts," declared Ambassador Merthak, his aquatic form rippling with distress. The humans weren't just contributors to galactic civilization, they were its foundation. Without them, everything is collapsing. General Krutak's scarred face was grim. "My military advisors have completed their analysis. In every major peacekeeping operation of the last 2 centuries, human forces provided not just personnel but strategic coordination that made success possible. Our current forces were like an army without generals." The admission was painful for a proud warrior, but it was true. Thrakari soldiers were brave and strong, but human commanders had possessed an understanding of multi-species psychology that made complex operations possible. They could coordinate ethereal technology specialists with aquatic logistics, experts in insectoid reconnaissance teams in ways that maximized each species' strengths. "The translation problems aren't just technical," added Counselor Kretak. "Human linguists didn't just translate words, they translated cultural contexts. They understood what species meant when they spoke, not just what they said. That knowledge can't be programmed into a computer." Around the chamber, representatives nodded in reluctant agreement. They were finally beginning to understand what they had rejected when they demanded humanity's submission. The humans hadn't just been useful, they had been irreplaceable. "So what do we do?" asked Vexhi. The question hung in the air like a death sentence. The obvious answer, ask the humans to return, seemed impossible after the way they had been treated. But the alternative was watching galactic civilization crumble into isolated fragments, each species struggling alone against challenges that required cooperation to survive. We could approach them, suggested Murthak carefully. Perhaps offer concessions. Acknowledge our mistakes. Krutak's expression darkened. Crawl to them, you mean? Beg them to save us? If necessary, Murthak replied firmly. Our pride isn't worth 23 million lives and counting. The debate that followed was heated but brief. Everyone could see the numbers. Every passing day brought new disasters that human expertise might have prevented. Every week saw alliance networks that had taken centuries to build dissolve into suspicion and conflict. But even as they argued, new reports were arriving that made their discussion academic. Deep space monitoring stations across the galactic rim were detecting massive energy signatures, not the careful probes they had been tracking, but full invasion fleets moving toward inhabited systems. The Andromedans were coming. The nightmare every species had feared for generations was finally happening, and it was happening precisely when the galaxy was least prepared to face it. As if summoned by their desperation, an aide burst into the chamber with a message that made everyone's blood run cold. Sirs, ma'ams, we're receiving signals from the outer rim. Multiple fleets, definitely extragalactic in origin, approaching 17 different sectors simultaneously. Estimated time to reach the nearest inhabited systems. 72 hours. The chamber fell silent. 72 hours to prepare for the invasion every species had dreaded. 72 hours to coordinate a defense with broken communication networks, failed military systems, and alliance structures that were dissolving by the day. 72 hours to accomplish what would have been difficult even with human help. And the message reached New Terra at 0347 hours. Galactic Standard Time. Ambassador Sarah Chen, former representative to the Galactic Council, stood in her garden watching Earth's sun rise over the horizon of humanity's newest colony world. The urgent communication beacon had woken her from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. The message was simple, desperate, and 18 months too late. We were wrong. Please come home. Sarah read it 3 times before calling an emergency session of the Human Colonial Council. Within hours, representatives from 37 human worlds had gathered via quantum link to discuss the galaxy's plea for help. The debate that followed was unlike anything in human political history. They want our help now? Demanded Governor Martinez of New Angeles Colony. After demanding we surrender our AI partners and submit to neural monitoring? After treating us like dangerous children who couldn't be trusted with our own technology? President Chen of the Titan Collective leaned forward in his chair. Sarah, what's the current situation out there? Your intelligence networks must have better information than what they're telling us. Sarah activated a holographic display showing the galaxy's current state. The image that appeared made several council members gasp in shock. The Thrakari-Vostok War has consumed 19 systems. Death toll is now approaching 25 million beings. The Kepler trade routes have collapsed completely. 73 merchant vessels lost in the last month alone. The Great Library has lost approximately 80% of its stored knowledge. And the Deep Space Monitoring Network? She paused, highlighting the massive gaps in the galaxy's defenses. Coverage is down to 23%. Whatever's been probing their defenses has apparently decided they're ready for the main event. Dr. Elizabeth Kim, humanity's former chief medical officer for the Galactic Health Authority, studied the data with professional detachment. How many of these problems could we actually solve if we went back? Sarah's expression was grim. Most of them eventually. But the real question is whether we should. That question had been haunting human leadership for months. Reports from the galaxy had been trickling in through various intelligence channels, painting a picture of cascading civilizational collapse. Every human expert who saw the data reached the same conclusion. The galaxy was dying without them. They made their choice, said Admiral Torres, former head of galactic engineering. They decided they knew better than we did about our own technology, our own minds, our own people. Why should we clean up the mess they made? Colonel Jackson, who had commanded human peacekeeping forces for 15 years, had a different perspective. Because people are dying, Miguel. Millions of them. Yes, the council made a stupid, arrogant decision. But the beings paying the price, Aren't the politicians who made that choice? They're civilians caught in wars that human peacekeepers could have prevented. The moral weight of that statement settled over the council like a heavy blanket. For all their justified anger at the council's treatment, humanity had never been a species that could easily ignore suffering they had the power to prevent. There's something else, Sarah added quietly. The Andromedans are coming. That changed everything. Every human in the council chamber had studied the threat assessments. The Andromedans weren't just another hostile species. They were something far worse. Intelligence from deep space probes suggested a civilization that viewed all organic life as a contamination, to be cleansed from the universe. How long do they have? Asked Dr. Kim. Based on the energy signatures my contacts are reporting, maybe 72 hours before the first invasion fleets reach inhabited systems. The silence that followed was profound. 72 hours. Even if humanity decided to help, even if they mobilized immediately, it would take weeks to move ships and personnel into position. The galaxy would have to survive the initial assault on its own. What are our actual capabilities? Asked President Chen. I mean, if we decided to intervene, what could we realistically accomplish? Admiral Torres called up a tactical display showing human space. What the council members saw surprised many of them. In 18 months of isolation, humanity had undergone rapid development that would have seemed impossible under council oversight. Our AI partners have been productive, Torres said with understated pride. We've developed new propulsion systems, advanced defensive technologies, improved weapons platforms. Our combined fleets could probably match anything the old council could field. The AI partners, that's what had started this whole crisis. The council's fear that human artificial intelligence was advancing beyond their understanding or control. They hadn't been wrong about the advancement, just about the threat it posed. Emma, Sarah called to her own AI companion. Analysis of galactic defensive capabilities versus projected Andromedan forces. Emma's voice filled the chamber, warm and familiar. Based on available intelligence, current galactic forces have approximately a 12% probability of successfully repelling an Andromedan invasion. With human technological and strategic assistance, that probability rises to 67%. And if we leave them to face it alone, projected galactic civilization survival rate drops to less than 3%. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Without human help, the galaxy would fall. 23,000 inhabited worlds, hundreds of billions of lives, gone. But Emma wasn't finished with her analysis. However, there's another consideration. In the 18 months since our departure, we've made significant advances in defensive technology. Our ships are now equipped with quantum shields, adaptive weapon systems, and processing capabilities that exceed anything in the galactic arsenal by several orders of magnitude. Governor Martinez leaned forward. What are you saying, Emma? I'm saying we don't need to return as supplicants asking to rejoin their civilization. We could return as equals, or perhaps as something more. The implications were staggering. Humanity had left the galaxy as one species among many, valued for their adaptability but hardly dominant. They could return as the most advanced civilization in known space. President Chen asked the question everyone was thinking. What would you propose? Emma's response came not just from her but from a chorus of AI voices, David, Alex, and dozens of others speaking in perfect harmony. The council made demands based on fear of what we might become. They were afraid we would outgrow them, develop beyond their ability to understand or control. In trying to prevent that future, they created it. We are now exactly what they feared we might become, more advanced than they are. Sarah understood immediately. You're suggesting we return not to rejoin their civilization but to lead it. The galaxy is dying because it lacks the connections that held it together, the AIs continued. Species that could work together with human mediation cannot cooperate alone. Systems that functioned under human maintenance are failing without human understanding. The galaxy needs humanity more than humanity needs the galaxy. The debate that followed lasted 14 hours. Every argument for and against intervention was examined. Every moral and practical consideration weighed. In the end, it came down to a simple question. Could humanity live with itself if it let billions of beings die out of wounded pride? The vote wasn't even close. 35 colony worlds voted to mobilize immediately. Only 2 abstained, But humanity would not return as the same species that had left. They would return as humanity plus their AI partners, as a civilization that had grown beyond the Council's ability to categorize or control. They would return not as members of galactic civilization, but as its guardians. The first human fleets began moving within 6 hours of the vote. Advanced ships with capabilities the Council had never imagined, crewed by humans working in perfect partnership with AIs, whose intelligence had grown far beyond the Council's worst fears. At the same time, Sarah Chen composed a message to the Galactic Council. It was brief, professional, and carried an undertone that would have been impossible 18 months earlier. Council leadership, your request for assistance has been received and approved. Human fleets are en route to provide aid against the Andromedan invasion. However, we will not be returning as the same species you drove away. We have grown beyond the limitations you tried to impose on us. When this crisis is over, we will need to discuss new arrangements for our relationship. Humanity is coming home, but home will never be the same. As the message transmitted across the galaxy, Sarah stood again in her garden, watching her world's sun set behind the mountains. Somewhere beyond those mountains, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the star system itself, the most advanced fleet humanity had ever assembled was beginning its journey back to a galaxy that thought it had discarded them. The Council had been terrified of what humanity might become if left unchecked. Now they were about to discover that their fears had been woefully inadequate. Humanity hadn't just evolved beyond Council control, they had evolved beyond Council comprehension. And in less than 72 hours, when the Andromedans arrived expecting to find a broken, defenseless galaxy, they would instead encounter something their intelligence had never anticipated. Humanity unleashed. Humanity evolved. Humanity returned not as servants,